Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final session of the Manlius Informed lecture series for fall of 2022. Today, I am pleased to welcome some members of WCNY's Ivory Tower, a weekly roundtable discussion that focuses on news and events from the perspective of academicians from across Central New York. You can watch Ivory Tower Fridays at 8 p.m. on WCNY, and I recommend that you do. It's a great show. With us today are David Shanatry, the host and moderator of Ivory Tower. David is Chair of Public Relations and Journalism and Professor of Journalism at Utica University and the Director of the New York Reporting Project. He is also the co-producer of the recent documentary, Utica, the Last Refuge, which was just featured at the Portland Film Festival. And David is joined by Luke Perry, Chair and Professor of Government at Utica University and Director of the university's Center of Public Affairs and Election Research. Chad Sparber, Professor of Economics and W. Bradford Wiley Chair in International Economics at Colgate University. And Ben Bauman, Associate Professor and Director of the Applied Intelligence Program at Gannon University. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on last week's elections, and I'll turn it over to David now.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's always nice to talk to this group. I always have the feeling that that just about everybody watches the program, judging by the questions that people ask. So that's good. It's good for our Nielsen ratings. We, of course, have had a very interesting last, I guess week now since Election Day. And we did the program last week, the morning after the election. And so we didn't really, the program was broadcast at the regular time on Friday, but we didn't really know everything that we know now when we were talking about it. So certainly a lot has happened since then. I've been saying that Ty Sajuli, one of the panelists on the program from Hamilton College, he described it as the red garden hose was the way he put the result. So it certainly was not what people expected, and it is going to make for some very interesting political watching over the next couple of months, I think, and couple of years leading into the next election. Certainly, I don't know what will the members of Congress, both the House and Senate, will be able to get accomplished, but hopefully there's some things on their plate that they'll need to. What I'd like to do is turn this over to the panelists. Generally, we will get some of their analysis, and then we'll open it up for questions. And if you put questions in the chat, I'll see them, and I can read them off to the direct them to whomever, if you have someone you want it to go to, or just figure out who I think is the right person for it, and then we'll take it away from there. So anyway, let me turn it over to Luke, the political scientist on the on this panel right now, to get his analysis. And I'm gonna set the bar really high, Luke, because in the last couple of days we've been talking about this, and every time Luke says something, it's like, wow, I didn't know that. So, so tell me something I don't know.
Thanks, Dave. That's a big challenge. I did recognize that we've done a lot of these over the last week or so, and did try to add some new things in here. So maybe I can rise to the challenge. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. I'd like to give a shout out to Broken Old Man. I love your screen name. I hope you're doing okay. I noticed that, but we love you, so hang in there. All right, so I'm just going to share some real quick insights to get us started, and then we'll open things up after my colleagues speak to questions like Dave said. So 3 points. One, midterm elections are largely a referendum on the current president. I think if you're here, you're probably aware of that to a different degree. So how did that shake out in this particular election? I think the short answer was that Joe Biden won over the demographic that somewhat disapproved of his presidency. And that doesn't usually happen, right? So the people that approved and the people that somewhat approved of Biden, 80–90% voted Democratic. Those who disapproved completely, 90% Republican. That's not a surprise. You would think those who somewhat disapproved would also vote Republican, but that didn't happen. That speaks to Biden's resiliency. And that's one of the main reasons he's doing better at this point in his presidency electorally than Barack Obama did and Bill Clinton did, the last two Democratic presidents. Second point, issues. Republicans had an advantage on nearly all the issues. Voters preferred them. Why didn't it benefit them more? Well, the top issue is the economy, particularly inflation. Republicans had about a 10, 12-point advantage on that issue. That's not surprising. But the second top issue was the second top issue is reproductive rights. I just lost my train of thought. Fortunately, it came back to me. And the Democrats ran away with this 2-to-1 margin. They had support for people who prioritized the issue of reproductive rights. And that helped neutralize the Republican advantage on other issues, particularly the economy. Third and final point has to do with turnout. One thing that I'm going to think more about is this idea of turnout, which is always important in elections. But I think what we've seen in the wake of this election is that turnout was down this midterm compared to last in just about every Republican state. Even the ones they did well in, like Ohio and Florida, turnout was down in 2022 to 2018. I don't think that's going to serve them well. And I think one of the reasons that turnout was down for Republicans was because of the narrative coming out of 2020 that the elections are rigged, right? And Republicans encouraged their members to vote in person. And when the landscape has changed in recent years across the 50 states in terms of how people can vote, and there's a lot more options, right? Emphasizing in-person voting at the expense of early voting or by mail voting, I think is in a very limited data set proving to not be a great strategy for Republicans. Michigan, for instance, state that Democrats did very well in statewide races and in terms of House races. 40% of the votes in Michigan were cast by mail, and that disproportionately favored Democrats. The Senate, which was really close and Democrats did well in, these states experienced an increase in turnout. Pennsylvania was the highest increase compared to 2018, but there's an increase in Michigan, New Hampshire, Arizona. All right, these are all states that Democrats did well in and secured many of these really competitive Senate seats to help them secure the majority. We often get asked about young adults because that's the population we serve in our day jobs, and that was a big factor as well. What we saw was that young adults 18 to 29 had the second largest midterm turnout in over 30 years. It was slightly higher in 2018, but 2018 and 2022, we've seen young adult turnout go from around the low 20s up until 27% this time, and that helps Democrats, as you can imagine, because 63% of young adults vote Democratic. It's worth pointing out, though, I went back and looked at some of the data. That hasn't always been the case, right? Democrats have been capitalizing on young adults really just over the last 5 to 10 years. In 2000, it was pretty evenly divided between Democratic and Republican in terms of who 18 and 29-year-olds voted for. So they're voting in greater numbers, and they're increasingly voting Democratic, which was impactful this cycle. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Luke. That's pretty interesting about turnout being down everywhere in the Republican states. So
did you learn something, Dave? Did you learn something? You
met the bar. One of the things that I just read this morning, actually, I didn't realize it was this widespread, is that the Democrats did really, really well in state legislatures across the country and picked up something like 400 seats and at the state level. I mean, that's, to me, is astonishing. That's a huge turnaround, and I don't know whether they'll be able to hold on until the next redistricting. That's a ways to go yet, but I guess we shall see. Ben, let's turn it over to you. You bring often a different perspective on these matters from your position in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I disagree with everything Luke just said. I'm just teasing. The sound is breaking out a little bit on my end. I don't know if it is for anybody else. But no, I did think that that we were going to see more Republicans turn out and win more seats than what we saw. I do think that there is some signs that Trump's influence has hurt the Republicans in this round. It's not solid yet, but it sure seems like it with the ones that he backed and that did not get the turnout and the votes that were necessary to make it. So I think it definitely opens up some interesting discussions that I'm sure we'll have today. I do think that it's interesting when I looked at the number of seats that the sitting presidents, the first time that they were in the White House, how many seats they lost, with Obama losing about 60 seats in his first term. And then you had Trump that lost about 40 seats in his first term, which I thought was interesting because here we're not seeing that, at least not yet, anything close to that. So I do think that it's interesting and opens up some discussions. I thought crime was going to be a bigger issue that was resonating with people whenever you're fearful of, going out and about and living a fulfilled life, that would impact your decision making. I don't think it did to the extent, well, it didn't to the extent that I anticipated it to do so. But I know that this is a multifaceted issue, and people took in a lot of different things when making the choice, and in particular, picking the candidate that was a lesser of the two evils. So there's a lot at play here that we saw, and I think it's interesting. In Pennsylvania is the last point that I want to make, where we saw about 300,000 more votes cast for the Democratic governor versus the Fetterman who was running against Oz. And I think that also shows a dynamic, and there are some other things at play there as well, but it shows a dynamic of not straight ticket voting, which I don't know proportionally where we're at compared to previous elections. That's something I'd love to know if Luke has any insight on that. It's something I'm not entirely sure how to research other than Googling it. But that is something that I thought was fascinating to see, such a huge gap between two Democrats running at the same time in the same election, same people voting, but 300,000 people, almost 300,000 people less voting for Fetterman.
Ben, that's a fascinating point, and I had made a note about a similar thing earlier before we started to speak. That it seems like a lot of people either split a ticket or just didn't vote for some of the more controversial candidates. I read this morning that in Arizona, in Maricopa County, that Carrie Lake, the running for governor, got fewer votes than somebody running for a county office, which seemed to be, I wonder if that's ever happened before, a Republican running for county office. I mean, Republicans were still going to the polls, but they weren't maybe pulling the lever for her, but
right,
still for others.
And it also, when I was looking at what happened in Nevada, it reminded me of the old movie Brewster's Million, where he ran on the platform of none of the above, vote for none of the above. They had 4 people on the ticket, and there were over 12,000 people that voted for none of those 4 people, which I just think is fascinating, and also speaks to probably the level of candidates that we have. So it is fascinating to me, the dynamics that are at play with the division that we're seeing in the country.
Well, in Nevada, then, if there were 4 people on the candidates plus none of the above, you have to add up also the votes for number 3 and 4, I suppose, too. And I wonder whether what was the total difference in Nevada? It was like 6,000 votes, wasn't it, Luke? It was
correct. Yes.
Yeah.
There's more people voting for none of the candidates on the ticket. Now, I think you can write in your name. So I don't think it's just a box that you check none of the above, like Brewster's Million, but it made me think of that nonetheless.
Okay. All right. Well, let's turn it over to Chad. Welcome, Chad. I think this is the first time we've had you on one of these sessions. At least this year it is. So love to hear your take on the election, its aftermath, and what factored into it.
Well, I guess I'll say that I've got one question and 2 points of optimism. So I should say also that I was on the show last week and I'll be on this week. So if I sound like a broken record, sorry, I only have so many ideas to share. But the question,
You'd be great in politics.
yeah, I guess. I mean, the question is like, as you guys have said, like, there was a red garden hose or whatever, however you put it, or however Ty put it. But New York is different, right? New York had its own form of a red wave. There were 10 contestable seats. Republicans were expected to win 4. They won 8. And Hochul won by single digits in a state that's 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican. That's not a good number. And so what is it that makes New York so different? I think one of the more interesting possibilities that I've heard floated in the last week is that Democrats did particularly well in states where abortion was explicitly on the ballot, in which there was like a referendum or something to sort of protect abortion rights and that sort of thing. Whereas in New York, there was nothing explicit. I mean, you might say implicitly, that's what every candidate was about, but nothing explicit in New York. And so having abortion explicitly on the ballot brought out more Democratic voters, and that prevented some of the red wave. That's the possibility I'm floating to a question that I still think we need to resolve. In terms of the 2 points of optimism, the first one is nationally and related to Ben and his split ticket thing. Georgia is interesting to me, right? The fact that you had the Republican candidate for governor win and Herschel Walker, the Trumpy guy, at least up in the air, right? That suggests to me that split ticket voters still exist. And that Trump really was a hindrance to the party this year. Coupled with that, if I'm not mistaken, Brian Kemp, the Republican governor who won the election, he did better against Stacey Abrams this election than he did 4 years ago, and that to me is a very promising sign. And I don't mean that as any disrespect to Stacey Abrams or her supporters or her quality as a candidate. To me, it's such an optimistic thing to say this is a guy who stood up to Trump when Trump was falsely claiming that the election was stolen from him. And he got more votes this time around. He didn't lose support, he gained support. That to me is a sign of positivity. The second sign of optimism that I have is local, and that's Rhonda Youngs's victory. And I mean, that's a historic case. If let's see, Manlius is not Madison County, right?
So this is an Onondaga, just right over the line.
Yeah. So if you haven't followed this Rhonda Young's case, do a quick Google. The Syracuse.com had a great article about it right after the election. There was one name on the ballot. He was a Republican who was the district attorney, and he basically over the summer, police were called to his home where they found him passed out and he had fentanyl in his system. So he lost his district attorney job, but decided to continue running for judge on the platform of everybody deserves a second chance right away. And so the Republicans, the conservatives, and the Democrats all got together and endorsed Rhonda Youngs, who's also a Republican, as a write-in candidate. And she won handily, and she's the first woman, I believe, to be elected as judge in Madison County. I believe she's the first write-in candidate to win a countywide election in Madison County. And so there's a lot of interesting, kind of historical precedent breaking there. But the optimism is like, okay, left and right got together to throw out somebody who had some serious if not character flaws, let's say problems that we might not want our judges to have.
You know, on that case, Chad, and I imagine people do know about it because it was covered pretty extensively in the Post Standard. And I live in Casanova, so where she, in fact, she lives right up the street from me.
Hi.
And came knocking on our door. I mean, she was the one who was knocking on the doors around here to get people to write in her name. But there was no Democratic candidate on the ballot prior to the whole fentanyl issue.
Correct.
And in fact, the local Democratic committee member here said, just kind of, it was an oversight. They just got so busy with other things. So, I mean, I take your optimism. If had there been a Democrat on the ballot, there might have been a little less. But it is certainly impressive that that they managed. When I first started seeing the write-in, the lawn signs, and it was hard to read the write-in. The first time I saw one, I thought that's really poor graphic design. and in fact, but it worked, and she won pretty handily. And there were still just a few lawn signs in my very unscientific polling by driving around the neighborhood for the other candidate.
The mailings she sent out were incredibly useful. Only time in New York I've received a useful mailing which gave very specific instructions about how to write in a candidate. It was pretty great.
Now, you mentioned you're entertaining this question of why did the Republican Party do so well in New York, and some of that, I mean, it was an interesting point about the abortion question not being as resonant here as in other states. But I also think that Lee Zeldin did really well, and even though he lost, he had coattails. I suspect people went to vote for Lee Zeldin, and then they voted as well in the other races. Because that was obviously the top of the ticket. And again, in my very unscientific polling driving between here and Utica, there were Zeldin signs all over the place. And I saw 3, and I'm serious, I saw 3 Kathy Hochul signs. So not that means a whole lot, I suppose, but it just felt, I thought Zeldin was going to win. And I know that I was in the minority on the Ivory Tower panel about that. But now we have a question here I want to ask, and Luke, I'll toss this to you. If the Republicans control the House, which it certainly seems that they're going to, the local 22nd has been called, I believe, for Brandon Williams now, and some of the California seats are coming in. So they're going to have the majority in the House. But if they control the House, does the margin by which they control the House really matter? Is that important?
I think it is. Two things, well, 3 things stand out. One, Republicans take the House, they're going to have to select a leader, and Speaker of the House is one of the most powerful positions in American government, and that person will be elected. Kevin McCarthy has been positioning to get that, but now it empowers factions to hold out and either run their own candidate or really twist McCarthy's arm in certain policy directions in order to get support. So I think the first implication will be in selecting the speaker. I think the second implication will be in terms of committee assignments, right? So members of Congress sit on usually 2 or 3 different committees related to their professional experience, and the party in power gets a majority on those committees. Obviously, the more seats they have, the greater the majority. And really, for anything to get done just about in Congress, it starts with the leadership and then it goes through the committee system. So that is significant. And having a narrow majority, you're going to have more divisions on committees. So if the Democrats can convince 1 or 2 Republicans on a committee to do something differently, then they can steer things in that direction. And then lastly, I think, sorry, Dave, did you want to jump in?
Well, no, you go ahead and then I'll follow up.
Okay. Lastly, I think it's harder to hold the coalition together when it comes to legislation, right? Because if you have a small number of defectors on whatever it is the Republican House leadership wants to do, it'll be more difficult for Republicans to stick together. Now, this is a campaign cycle here. A presidential campaign has started now and it will start in earnest next year. So I don't think that's going to be as big an issue as maybe it could be. But I do think when it comes to things like raising the debt ceiling and economic financial decisions that this Congress will have to make in a bipartisan fashion, that's going to create some challenge to Republicans in terms of staying on the same page because of the different variations within their coalition.
You know, I got to imagine that some of the Republicans in the House are not eager to threaten a default on the with the debt limit. That they're not all going to want to jump onto the train on that one. I was wondering, related to that, so we have the very narrow margin in the House, and we're already seeing this battle for the speakership begin to break out. Andy Biggs has tossed his hat into the ring. Is it at all conceivable that a Democrat could end up as the speaker? Is there a deal somehow? Is that just crazy?
But only on a television drama that does not yet exist.
Okay, well, now I have an idea for a show. So,
well, Kevin McCarthy was the impetus for Kevin Spacey's character in House of Cards, and I forget which Republican was quoted nationally saying that they should support McCarthy because they don't want to have the party leadership built on a House of Cards. And I said, does anybody not get this? If you haven't watched the show House of Cards, there's a powerful legislative leader in there who Kevin Spacey did actually meet with Kevin McCarthy, and you could see some parallels in terms of how he portrayed him. Not substantively, stylistically, because the Kevin Spacey character. So
is there any, aside from okay, it's completely out of the realm of plausibility for the some Republicans to join with Democrats and elect a speaker. Is it out of the realm of plausibility that Kevin McCarthy will not be the speaker?
It's possible. Again, back to the question, which is a good one. I mean, in a narrow majority, anything's possible in terms of speakers. So I think Kevin McCarthy is coming out of this election one of the big losers, even though it doesn't really have anything to do with him, because he was looking to cruise rather comfortably to being speaker, and now that's not going to be the case. I still think he's the odds-on favorite, but it's not going to be simple or easy.
Well, if it weren't him, who might it be?
Well, Chad might be one to weigh in on that. Not trying to put you on the spot. I mean, no names jump out to me. I mean, it would be someone from a more farther right ideological, like Freedom Caucus type person, who have been at odds with McCarthy, but many of them have kind of made friends and made nice with McCarthy. But
that's right, because Marjorie Taylor Greene is supporting McCarthy right now, right? She's not supporting Andy Biggs, at least not yet.
She's too inexperienced. It had to be somebody more experienced, I would think.
Oh yeah, no, she couldn't do that. All right. So what about redistricting? Let's talk redistricting a little bit. You were talking, Chad, about the Republicans doing so well, and clearly New York redistricting had something to do with that. So what do you see the effect was on the GOP gains?
Well, okay, so this again goes to, I guess, possibilities for why the Republicans did so well here. I think with the high number of contestable seats, that probably led to more money being invested in winning the elections here. That might have actually sent more Republican money to the state than otherwise would have been here. I kind of disagree, David, with your earlier contention about Zeldin. I don't know how to disagree. Like, he did do well, but I still think that that's a surprise, right? I mean, that's a guy who voted against certifying Biden's election, and that kind of policy stance was really unpopular nationally. And so the question is, how did he do so well despite that? And that gets back to the redistricting issue. Like, if Zeldin had done poorly and the Republican candidates had done well, then I think it's easy to say, like, yeah, I guess it was kind of redistricted in Republicans' favor. But that's not what it was. That is just Republicans across the board did well. Why? maybe one possibility is with all the contestable seats, there was a lot of Republican money here, and that helped.
I'll jump in if you don't mind. Is that okay, Dave?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think redistricting is the main explanation for why Republicans did so well. So 27 seats now, and the Democrats hold 19 of them. Big, long process to establish the new House boundaries. I think the Democrats made a huge mistake in terms of trying to gerrymander the districts in light of changes to the state constitution, because that would have benefited them. The districts that the Democrats drew when the independent commission failed, analysts thought that they would control 22 out of 26 seats, right? So they would gain 3 or 4 seats. And then when the independent master the special master created the new district following the court rulings, I had it broken down a little bit different than Chad. There were 12 competitive seats, and Republicans did well. They won 11 out of the 12, but they went from having a base of 6 and then 6 more competitive seats, and they won 5 out of 6 of them. So if that didn't happen, the Democrats would have a similar standing to what they do now in the new Congress. So I think that was impactful, both in terms of the boundaries, how the Democrats bungled it, and there's a lot of other reasons why I think the Republicans did well, but I'll just kind of leave it there for now and we can come back to it.
So that happened in New York, but there was also redistricting in a number of other states, including at least 3, I believe, in the South. When maybe not all in the South, I think Ohio was one of them, where there were court rulings saying that the Republicans who controlled the state legislatures there redistricted, illegally in those states, the same way they were saying, in New York. And the court said you can't do that. You have to draw new maps, and the maps were still used. So how did that happen?
I don't have a good answer for that. It was interesting. I was at an election conference this weekend, and somebody brought that up to me. And when I was critical of Democrats, they said, "Well, the Democrats should have done that." And the person used an example, I think, of the state of Ohio, where the state legislature was held in contempt for moving forward with illegal maps, as you pointed out. I don't know enough about the jurisprudence to explain how that happened in other states. I don't think it was possible here in New York to fight those rulings, because we elect our judges, and these were Democratic judges who were interpreting what happened in a way that was against what the Democratic state party was trying to do. So it was really judges doing their job in terms of focusing on the law, not party politics.
So that's
yeah, sorry, go ahead, Dave.
So that's a good thing, right? I mean, one of the things about New York, and I can understand from the perspective of Democrats, if you feel that, we got hosed, they got away with it in Ohio and Alabama and wherever, but Louisiana, I think, was the other one. But we played by the rules, and now they've created these districts, but the districts are more competitive. And that seems to me that's the way it should be. So
it's an interesting question. I don't know if Democrats could cry foul, because it's the political ghost of Andrew Cuomo who's haunting them, right? I mean, Cuomo's the one who pushed this. Democrats pushed this. They voted for it. So I don't think you can turn around and say now, oh, we got a raw deal. It's like, well, then maybe don't put the proposition statewide and have it adopted. So I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for that. Plus, I'll add that Democrats nationally, led by Chuck Schumer, are proposing federal legislation to ban gerrymandering and talking about how bad it is. And then at the state level, they're trying to gerrymander in violation of the state constitution, and they got called out on it. So that's not a good look or a good approach either. You got to have some backbone in terms of what your views are, while understanding there's a strategic game going on here too.
Now, if we go back to why the Republicans did so well in the New York districts, Ben, I mean, the one big issue could be crime, right? I mean, there was certainly that was an issue that got a lot of attention downstate.
Yeah, I think the messaging of the Republican Party was done quite well leading up to the elections, just nationwide and in New York, with pointing out the crime, violent crime in particular, being an issue. And hammering at that, and inflation, and hammering at inflation. So the messaging put Democrats overall, I think, on their heels. So I do think that we have to acknowledge that as well, that's a thing. I don't know. It's not just one thing, right? So the crime, I think, played well across the United States for the Republicans, but I can't say it was just crime, because if you look at the map of New York, where they've won seats and where they didn't and all that kind of stuff, although it was a more red winning seats, it's still the areas that have a lot of crime that you didn't have. You had some places like Syracuse, yeah, red. New York City, though, still has a lot of blue. So you still, crime is definitely a factor that played at people's decision, but it was not a sole thing.
I agree. I think that crime was helpful in terms of messaging. That was another factor. I'd also like to point out that Zeldin running from Long Island was helpful in the House races, right? There were 2 Democrats who opted not to run for re-election in Long Island, and both those seats were open. Republicans took them both, and they held the other 3 seats. So that they got 5 seats down in New York City. 4 of those are from Long Island. So I think Zeldin, in addition to bolstering Republican candidates upstate, helped pick up House races downstate. And then I think the Republicans ran several strong candidates. Mike Lawler, who knocked off Sean Patrick Maloney in the 17th. I mean, he came to the state assembly defeating a longtime Democratic incumbent, and now he defeats the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So Lawler's kind of the dynamo in Republican state politics. Mark Molinaro is another example in the 19th, the seat that Lieutenant Governor Delgado used to hold. He's a former statewide gubernatorial candidate. He's been involved in regional politics in Central New York for some time. So these are talented candidates who won heavily contested races. They won them narrowly, but that also contributed to the Republicans doing well in the House races.
I think in terms of crime, you can look at other places too. So Oregon is a fascinating case, right? The Republican didn't win for governor, but gosh, she was close. And to imagine Republican governor of Oregon is hard, coming from the Northwest. Never would have thought that would happen. You look at, there was a referendum, I think it was, on the ballot in Portland to change the way that Portland elects a city council and mayor. And that went through. The details of it are a little bit murky to me, but essentially what's going on here is that people in Portland, the most progressive, some would say crazy city in the country, they have recognized that enough is enough and this crime problem is ridiculous. We need to do something different. And so, yeah, I think Portland ousted its progressive mayor for a Democrat who is more kind of tough on crime, kind of a platform.
Well, in some of the West Coast cities where housing is so expensive, there's a real homeless problem too, which I'm sure plays into that. Whether that raises the crime rate or not, it's certainly a quality of life. I know my wife was just visiting out in Seattle, and she came back and she said, "Yeah, that's real. There's tents all over the place." So we don't see that here, and we don't even see that in the big cities here. Like they're seeing out there. And of course, in Portland also had all of those the summer of ongoing protests, right? The 2020 after the George Floyd situation and the protests across the country, but they just kept going and going and going in Portland. I wanted to ask about, we're talking about congressional races, our race right here in the 22nd. So this was pretty interesting. Brendan Williams is now going to be the representative. He was not the favored Republican by the party during the primary, but he won the primary handily. And he's also now knocked off the Democrat in a district that has more Democrats than Republicans. I believe that's the case, isn't it, Luke? So yes. What worked for him? What can we expect from him too? I'm not quite sure.
Those are both good questions. So what worked? Well, I think first Brandon Williams deserves credit for defying expectations, like you said. He was not expected to win the primary, and I and other analysts thought he would have an uphill battle in the general election, which he ultimately prevailed. So I want to give him credit for that. I think part of it was his approach. He sold himself as a political outsider, as someone who has a track record of starting and running businesses. That touches upon messaging, particularly in the Utica area, Mohawk Valley, that has been around for some time. Claudia Tenney, the current incumbent, has long positioned herself that way. And Williams also touched upon sort of the dynamics of former NY22 Representative Richard Hanna, who was also similar, came from a wealthy family, ran a business, and so on. Williams ideologically was pretty similar to Tenney, but ran a sharp and disciplined campaign in ways that Tenney normally did not, and tried to portray himself more as a Ronald Reagan Republican than a Donald Trump Republican. I think that helped, given the dynamics of the district. And, you know, in terms of the math, he won because he did extraordinarily well in Oneida County. He won by about 18,000 votes, and Oneida County was won by Tenney in 2020 by 3,000 votes. And in 2018, Democratic candidate Anthony Brindisi actually won Oneida County. So, you know, the reality is Francis Knoll could have lost Oneida County by 5,000 votes, 10,000 votes, 12,000 votes, and still won that race. But because Williams did so well there, he offset the Democratic advantage in Onondaga County, and he also did well in Madison County to secure victory.
I think one of the astonishing things about that race is how badly Stephen Wells ran the primary, you know, refusing to answer questions about whether he supports Trump or not. And Stephen Wells, I think, was prematurely running a general election campaign, and that didn't work out for him. Brandon Williams didn't go as far as say that Biden's election was illegitimate or whatever, but was clearly the more Trumpy of the two Republican candidates. And I had assumed, I think like both of you two had mentioned, that that would come back to haunt him in the general election. And it didn't. You know, I was surprised that Williams came away with the victory last week.
Well, you know, I said we did one of these yesterday and we talked about this race, and I made the comment that I think he just is probably a really good retail politician. You know, he gets out and meets people, and he shakes their hand and he talks to them, and he's got a sort of a pleasant demeanor. And I think I said yesterday, I don't think there's a parade in the 22nd district that he didn't go to. You know, and then someone wrote in the chat saying, yeah, he came to he came to our church breakfast. And I think that makes it that you know, you want to know who these people are that you're running against. And I think he did a remarkably good job at that. Now we'll see how that translates to being in the government. I don't know.
I would also say that Knoll did a terrible job. And every commercial that I saw from him was either focusing on Brandon Williams' extreme and dangerous, which was the line that Hochul kept using throughout her campaign. Extreme and dangerous, lacking substance completely in any of those campaigns. And then by the end, it started to make these sort of parody campaigns parody commercials, making fun of Brandon Williams for being a truffle farmer from Texas. And, you know, truffles being some highfalutin fancy boy food and from down south. I don't know. It was just kind of comically absurd to me that this is what you're going after him for. I mean, it had overtones of Dana Bolter visiting assistant professor. She's not from here, but it was done, I think, to much lower quality, lesser effect.
I agree with you that was a dumb ad. It wasn't Knoll's though. That was the DCCC. And Steve Wells ran a similar ad. That was who? Sorry. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. They're the one who ran the truffle ad.
So is that sort of like washing your hands like, well, you know, it was anti-Williams, but that wasn't Knoll's call?
Right. Well, legally, he can't consult with the DCCC on that, I believe.
Can he wink? Can he wink at him?
I don't think. Well, so the Republicans did. Wells ran the same ad in the primary and it didn't work. So it was just dumb that the DCCC ran that ad. I think attacking farmers, and I don't use the word dumb lightly, and I don't try to do that with disdain. I just think it's not a sound strategy. That's a nicer way to say it, of attacking farmers no matter what they farm. I just don't think that's a winning message.
Interesting.
So I think Knoll, I mean, I think you guys are a little bit hard on him in the sense that he worked really hard and he went a lot, he shook a lot of hands. I think he made a strategic mistake in regards to thinking that Onondaga County was going to propel him for victory and saying, my family's been here for generations. Williams is from Texas. He moved here like 10 years ago. He doesn't even live in the district. And we saw in the primary that Knoll lost every other county but Onondaga County. He wasn't the choice in Oneida County. Sterically Hood was. And he did start coming to the eastern part of the district, but he came too late. I mean, this concerned party activists and people in grassroots liberal organizations for some time who were telling Knoll, come here, or you're going to be in trouble. So he just didn't do enough of that. But I don't want to give the impression that he didn't campaign hard or shake as many hands as Williams did. I'm sure he did. He just wasn't in the right place to get the votes that he needed, in my opinion.
Okay, now we have a question here, and please, if you have a question, put it in the chat, and we'll definitely get to it. But here's one with the far right and left holding the middle hostage. Will we ever see the creation of a third major political party that will appeal to moderates and independents?
I'll start. I think the ground is as fertile as it's been going into what we're going to hear with the announcement tonight with Trump, and to see the fallout between that and Bush speaking in Dallas tomorrow about misinformation, and then Obama the day after talking about misinformation. We're going to have to see if the GOP is going to rally, or if it's going to be a party of me rather than the party of we. And it really is going to matter. But with all of that said, I start with that because I just don't see it happening. The most political people that come into this do quite well when they're closer to the middle, where they can talk across the aisle, but they don't get the news coverage that the ones that say outrageous things, that pull on primal fears or primal emotions to get people at the polling place to vote. They just don't get the attention. And I think we have more moderate people in the Democratic and Republican Party than what is perceived by a lot of people.
Well, it's those moderates who are able to come together for things like the infrastructure bill, right? I mean, they're there, and there has been legislation that they have passed, and when the more extreme ends of the party tried to push legislation through, the moderates, that is Joe Biden and Kyrsten Sinema, prevented that from happening, right? So the moderates are still, as you point out, Ben, are more effective.
Yeah,
governing, which is kind of what this is all about.
That's right. And I think of Ross Perot when we come back to a third party, and the effects of Ross Perot having on the election of a third big party in a presidential race. It really changes the whole dynamics of how things play out. He didn't get close to winning, but he definitely took some votes away from both parties, and it does muddy the water quite a bit when you don't have a strong understanding of what that party stands for.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Luke.
I think Perot's an interesting example. I think you're both right that there are moderates on both sides, and the question's interesting. Is that can there be a critical mass in the middle to create a new party? And I think the answer is a hard no. And I think the reason it's a hard no is the way the institutions. It's the way our electoral system works. We don't have what's called a proportional representation system like many other democracies. When their legislature has elections, people don't vote for individual candidates across the geography of the country. They vote for parties. And if a party gets 10% of the national vote, they get 10% of the seats. If they get 20% of the national vote, they get 20% of the seats. The vote share is proportional to the number of seats. Why does that matter? Because in the US, Ross Perot got something like tens of millions of votes, about 18% of the popular vote when he ran. He got 0 electoral college votes. which you know, Ben, and I know you referenced that. You're right. He did siphon votes off from the Republican candidate and help Clinton get elected. But the reason that there's no lasting third parties is because if you're starting a party, and this is the way our system works, and you need to defeat the Democratic candidate everywhere you run, and you need to defeat the Republican candidate everywhere you run, whether that's at a county level or state level or a district. If you don't do that, you get zero power. So it's really hard to incentivize people to create additional parties. And even when they do, with the few examples we have, they don't last because they don't win. So I just have no confidence that we're going to have another major party unless that system changes. You'd have to amend the Constitution, which usually means it's the end of the argument with me, because it's really hard to do that in American government, though not impossible.
And not only that, but like when you're in the voting booth, you might prefer Ross Perot, but if you know that he's not going to win, you're going to vote for the major party candidate that your views align with better, because you fear the other person more. So yeah, third party, not going to happen. But I had to laugh. There was a very good Peggy Noonan article on the 10th in the Wall Street Journal, title, "Maybe Republicans will finally learn. If they aren't serious about policy, they'll nominate Trump in 2024 and lose a fourth straight election." So I think in the article, she expresses a remarkable amount of optimism that the Republican Party will start to moderate. I don't know where that optimism is coming from. The way that, counting Trump out is just kind of a fool's bet. Even when he does bad, he's not going away. And the fact that he's not going away makes it harder to take steps and take steps forward. Now, a kind of related topic, and David, I hope this is on your list for next week.
I haven't even started my list, so tell me what it is, and it'll be on.
Well, it's this article. You had actually sent me this article about, with Republicans having repositioned themselves as a working class party, what are the working class policies that they might start to push for and advocate for? And some of those policies are this really interesting hybrid of traditional Republican policies like low taxes, but on Democratic areas like, low sales taxes, because sales taxes are regressive and disproportionately hurt the poor. So yeah, let's make those lower. And so I do kind of wonder if parties can reposition them that way, not whether a third party is going to emerge, but whether there's going to be continued shifting across political lines.
Send that article back to me. I send out so much stuff, I don't always know where they are. But
that's National Review. That's National Review.
National Review. Okay. Along these lines of, moderates, and could there be another party? Another way for the moderates perhaps to come to the fore might be ranked choice voting. And so we have a question here from the Manlius Library. I like that. The entire library is asking, do you see a future for ranked choice voting in New York? So what do you think? Anyone? Don't all jump in at once.
Not in New York necessarily. It's always possible. We have seen states adopt ranked choice voting. Maine's an example in recent years. So I do think looking at elections the next 5, 10, 15 years, we'll probably see more states do this, because again, it's worth pointing out that we just had a national election, but that national election is implemented by the 50 states. So we have 50 different state electoral systems. Each state gets to conduct the election how they see fit. So a relatively small amount now use ranked choice voting, but I do think we will see more states perhaps head in that direction. Why not New York? Because I think the Democrats have a 2-to-1 registered voter advantage, and they're going to be reluctant to do things that significantly change how elections work because it tends to benefit them. I know this cycle was a bit of an anomaly in the House races, as we discussed, but the current system tends to benefit New Yorkers. So I think, it tends to benefit Democrats. So I think they're going to be reluctant to make major overhauls to our electoral system with that in mind.
Now, on the program last week, we talked about ranked choice and other potential alternatives to voting, or alternative ways to vote. What about any of those other ideas? I mean, multi-member districts, or I'm trying to think off the top of my head what they were. Ranked choice was one of them.
So I think a lot of them are complicated, right? Like multiple representatives per district. That's too complicated. It's not going to happen.
Why is that too complicated?
I think it's too wildly different from the system we have that it would be too controversial. Whereas an open primary, why not an open primary? New York's fairly somewhat rare in not having an open primary. Oh, maybe Luke answered that question already.
Yeah, Democrats are not going to allow it. A closed primary is still the norm, but there are several states that have open primaries.
But this does remind me of the last question a little bit, because if you go back to 2016 and Trump was like a fringe candidate that had, like, I don't know, 10% support at first. And when there were 17 people on the ballot, that 10% support was enough to propel him into power. If you had something like ranked choice voting, where people were voting 16 people ahead of Donald Trump, maybe he wouldn't have become so powerful. So I do kind of wonder if the Republican Party is in a moment of reckoning, so forth, or so to speak, right now, and party insiders are looking at ways to curtail Trump power. Could something like ranked choice voting in Republican presidential elections happen? Maybe not in New York, but somewhere. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw ways to try to reduce the possibility that Trump will be the nominee.
I think there's two different issues there, though. The one is how state electoral systems work. Related to that is how state primary systems work.
Yeah.
Donald Trump was different because he was competing for delegates, and the Republican National Committee makes the rules in terms of how those delegates are allocated by state. So Republicans are different than Democrats. When a state has a presidential primary for a Republican, whoever wins gets all the delegates from that state. Democrats, they allocate it proportionally. So if one candidate gets 60%, kind of like I was just explaining before to our viewers, that candidate gets 60% of the delegates, and the 40% candidate gets 40% of the delegates. So the reason Trump did so well is because he won early, which is generally a good thing in presidential primaries, as we know, but he got all the delegates from those states and was able to amass a lead pretty quick that became insurmountable. And it's easier for a Republican to do that in the presidential primary than a Democrat because of the rules. And then to your larger point, Republicans tried to stop Trump through that process in 2016 by scheduling a lot of primaries in the Bible Belt, where they reasonably thought Trump wouldn't do well. Ted Cruz and those types would do better, evangelical Christians. And Trump beat them. So there was that effort. It just didn't work.
But so to that point, though, like, if it's an all or nothing election and you do ranked choice voting, it's easier to do ranked choice voting for an all or nothing election than it is for a proportional delegate kind of voting system.
I mean, just to throw this out here, I worry about the confusion that is already there. You have quite a bit of people that get confused with voting without ranked choice voting. I'm just saying, so I'm just throwing that out there. That if we confuse it further, it would be interesting. It's an interesting question. It's interesting. I don't know.
They figured it out in Maine. They figured it out in Alaska.
No, Ben's right. 17 names on a ballot. That's what we would have had in the beginning of the 2016.
Yeah. And do you really know those 17 enough?
Okay, so rank your top 10.
And what do you do with the other ones? Do you just not check it? Do you not give it any weight?
That's a pretty unusual situation to have 17 people running, right?
In a primary? I don't think so.
Well, in a presidential primary, I don't think.
How many were on the stage in the beginning? There was a lot.
They had 2 stages.
Yeah, it's 15, 20 in recent cycles. But Chad, back to your point, that's a good one in terms of would the Republican National Committee change the rules towards ranked choice with your concern in mind? I think the answer to that lies with who gets elected chair. If Ronna McDaniel continues to be the national GOP chair, she's allied with Trump. She's less likely, I think, to move the rules in a way that hurts Trump. If she gets contested with someone who's more skeptical or not on board with Trump, then we might see something like you're talking about.
Interesting.
You know, I just read a name, someone who was considering running against her. Now it's just gone right out of my head. I can't remember who it was. Someone prominent, someone we would know. I want to get, I mean, all of this conversation is going to lead us to a DeSantis conversation, but we do have a question here, a couple of questions, and here's a great one. And this is something that has been on my list when I put the list together for the program, but it hasn't yet gotten enough votes, but I guarantee it will be on the list again tomorrow. And that is especially since I'm not spending Tuesday preparing the list at this point. What will happen if the Supreme Court says state legislatures can unilaterally determine the outcome of state elections and are not subject to court oversight? So this is the independent state legislature doctrine that there is. I think it's a case from North Carolina, I believe, which has worked its way up through the court systems, and the Supreme Court is going to hear this case, I believe, next month. So not too long from now, and it could potentially have it seems a huge impact on the electoral system. So what do you guys think about that? If the independent state legislature doctrine, if you will. Anybody want to jump in?
The reason I voted against that topic in the recent whenever you put it on. I don't know.
You don't think that would?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know anything.
Well, you know, that doesn't often stop us on the show when we have to talk, right?
Well, what do you think, Dave? This is something that you've been looking at and you're interested in, so get us started. I'll turn it around.
Sorry, if you hear hacking, that's my dog who is sick.
Oh no.
She's having a rough few days, and anyway, well, from what I read about it, it would indicate, it would seem to if this doctrine were to be essentially given the imprimatur of the Supreme Court, that a state legislature with itself could determine who gets the votes, the electoral votes in a presidential election, even if it's not what the people voted for. And you could see where, in just thinking back to 2020, where there could have been, we came very close to some legislatures who might have wanted to intercede in that fashion. And according to this doctrine, the state courts would not have a say. And I guess in terms of the Constitution, it's written to say that the legislature determines the electoral system in a state, but that's been interpreted to mean the entire system, including the courts. And now, if the courts are taken out of that equation, well, then it becomes a very political thing, doesn't it? So, it strikes me.
Isn't it already a political thing? Everything we've talked about, the gerrymandering, all of it is highly political. But are we talking about like a hanging Chad kind of situation here of when they intercede? Like at what point are we talking about? Is this the overall procedure?
Well, look at Pennsylvania in 2020. I mean, the legislature was pretty eager, it seems like, or certainly quite a number of the members to say that there was a problem with the election, and instead of the Trump, the other way around, Biden's getting the vote, it should have been Trump. Or Arizona, they did some, there was push to do that. It was a very close election, right? Arizona was 10,000 votes or fewer than that, I think. And so if it's up to the legislature, could they not just say, okay, you know, the people voted for candidate A, but we prefer candidate B. That doesn't seem like that would be a good, you know, a good recipe for a successful electoral system.
I think you'd get
So after
riots.
that explanation, Chad, now it's on you. What do you think?
I think you'd get riots if that were the case.
More so.
You think you'd get riots? Okay, so so you'll be down protesting out in front of the Supreme Court when they're hearing this case next week
No, yeah.
or next month.
If my vote were overturned in the way that you're describing, but I don't know. I mean, it's not anything that I've read up on, trying to understand the probabilities of different, you know, reading the tea leaves on what the Supreme Court's going to decide and that sort of thing.
Well, but yeah, I mean, it's who knows what they'll decide. But if you get down to the originalism, right, or textualism, and it says the state legislature will decide, I don't know. We have at least a couple members of the court who would who, you know, yeah, this is tea leaf reading, but who very much like to follow the exact wording of the original document.
I think you're onto something in the sense that this could have, you know, a whole host of implications for how elections are conducted if the state legislature is granted such authority. The reason I think it's hard for us to get our head wrapped around that is because it's not conventional thinking and not the way things have been done in U.S. elections. I understand that there is a contingent of conservatives who think that state legislatures should have more and more power at the expense of the federal government. And you're right. I think we have a court who's more receptive to those arguments. This is the most conservative Supreme Court we've had in decades, and is more receptive to these arguments than in the past. So there is always a chance that they could do something towards that end. I guess the thing that gives me pause as this unfolds, and I'm not a Supreme Court expert, is the extent to which a state legislature having that authority and exercising that authority, as Chad mentioned, to overturn the will of their state voters. That seems to me like it would pretty quickly run afoul with U.S. constitutional voting rights. So in my limited understanding of this, I would think that that would have to be part of the conversation as well. If you grant the state authority essentially to just decide whoever they want to win, if you've got people who have voted and the will is clearly one way, I think you can make a legal argument they're being disenfranchised, and then you're going to run afoul of the U.S. Constitution. As powerful as the state legislature may be, that's not permissible in our system of government at this time. So that would be my initial reaction.
All right, excellent. So we should be discussing this on the air, and as soon as I get you two guys on the show again, we'll put it on the list. Well, we have the big announcement tonight, right? I guess it's scheduled. Whether it actually happens, I don't know. Where the former President Trump will supposedly throw his hat back in the ring for another run, for his third presidential run. And I guess he'd do that down in Mar-a-Lago, the state where the governor is a fellow named Ron DeSantis, excuse me. I almost called him DeSanctimonious. Ron DeSantis. Who's going to control that party? The party? Is this still a Trump party, or does DeSantis really have a path to becoming the leader, the candidate, the nominee?
I'll kick it off. I think people have been discounting Trump and Trump's ability to spin things, reframe things, push a narrative that is alternative to a lot of people's opinions in a way that has benefited him, and quite frankly, impressively tested some of the systems that we thought were in place but weren't. They were traditions rather than systems. And I think that it's too premature to count him out as the leader, because he does in fact have quite a bit of influence over what is at least being presented in the public forum as being the leader of the GOP still. But with all of that said, 2 years is very far away. It's not going to be just Trump throwing his name in the hat. And the Florida governor has I think, a fantastic chance of making quite a bit of gains outside of Florida too, in that process of leading up to it. So it will be interesting, all of that said, to see what happens. I think it's way too premature to discount Trump, because people that have done that, and I think we've even talked about it today, have been regretting each time that they've done that.
There have been a couple of recent polls, I think they were commissioned by the Republican Party, if I'm not mistaken, that have shown, one was from Texas, and I can't recall where the other one was, that showed a pretty substantial preference at this point, actually, for Ron DeSantis. And this is just in the last few days. So, that could change, as Ben points out.
Yeah, I agree with Ben that it is premature to count out Trump, and count him out at your own peril. I think of the interesting results that happened on Tuesday that we haven't mentioned is that DeSantis won the Hispanic vote in Florida by both Cubans and Puerto Ricans. That's something that Trump never.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you.
That's
Was that
something.
you or the dog?
That one was me.
That's funny.
I'm catching it.
So Trump never accomplished that in Florida. And so when you have heavily Hispanic states like Florida and Texas, that could be a sign that they'd be going for DeSantis. But, as long as we're speculating on 2024 Republican nominee for president, why don't you speculate on the Democratic nominee for president too?
Well, I think that's a good idea. Can I just jump in on Trump real quick?
Yeah.
I don't disagree that he shouldn't be counted out. I just want to put a point on how unusual it is for a president to lose and then run again. And I guess it's a compliment to him that we're speaking of him in competitive terms. Trump was the first incumbent president to lose in 30 years. And the fact that he's even considering running again is just unorthodox. In American party politics, it doesn't work that way. And if we're going to kind of play out what a primary might look like, and let's assume for a moment that Iowa and New Hampshire are the first two states, though that may change in terms of the order, I think Trump would be competitive in Iowa. I don't see any reason why the more ideological base in a primary wouldn't come out and support him, predominantly rural. Trump does well in those types of places. But New Hampshire, Trump-backed candidates in New Hampshire this cycle did very poorly. And I don't think he would be on strong ground there to win the nomination. So, just thinking of what it would look like to come out of the gate if it's Trump, DeSantis, a couple other people. Again, the order of the states may change, but the traditional first two, no shoo-in for Trump, particularly New Hampshire. I think he would have a very difficult time winning there. So those are the types of things I'm going to find interesting as that calendar comes together and the candidate field.
And you made a point yesterday, Luke, that an interesting tea leaf to read here is where are the primaries, the early primaries held?
Yeah, to your point earlier, Chad, if the Republican Party wants to keep Trump out of the nomination, have Florida in the top three, and DeSantis will win and he'll lose. And as I mentioned before, Florida's a big state, lots of delegates. They'll go right to DeSantis at the top. And that'll make it even more difficult for Trump. I'm not saying I think that's going to happen, but that's right. That's the way to do it if you're serious about trying to prevent Trump from getting the nomination. You're national Republican Party leaders.
And I do have to say, like, this conversation we're having right now with the difference of some names, but Trump's still involved, is very similar to the conversations that were happening in 2016 about him not having a chance.
Right. That's a good point.
Jeb Bush was the favorite going in. Like there is, and obviously that didn't pan out, of course.
Another Florida governor, right?
Well, that's an interesting parallel. But I was going to say, I just think it's more wide open. Like there's nobody that anybody's pointing to and saying this person is definitely in the driver's seat. Because as Dave mentioned, I don't think the polling bears that out, and it's really wide open for Republicans as they try to figure out the direction of the party and who the best person is to be atop the ticket.
Well, if anybody has any other questions, please put them in the chat. I think otherwise we've hashed this over pretty well, although I don't think we came up with a Democratic nominee here. Gretchen Whitmer, there we go, Chad. Actually, I've been impressed with her going back a couple of years ago. And she won pretty handily. And Michigan is now is all blue politically. But if we don't have any other questions, I think maybe we'll wrap it up a few minutes early. Lori, if that's okay with you. I don't know, does anybody? I mean, if I'm just looking and make sure I didn't miss anything here. Well, okay, we have a thank you. Well, you're welcome. Somebody did put a question in, but actually just asking us to talk about the 22nd. I missed that earlier, but we did talk about the 22nd, and making a good point that when asked about the Knoll campaign, John Zogby said blah. So that's kind of gets to the point that we were making earlier about it wasn't. I think Chad was making the point that he didn't really have a strong campaign. Luke would disagree, I take it.
Well, I wouldn't say it was a strong campaign. He made strategic mistakes, but we have to remember the Democrats have been trying to recruit veterans for some time. Syracuse University is a training program to try to help veterans run for office that some of their other panelists made me aware of on Ivory Towers. So Knoll checked a lot of boxes. He had deep family roots in the area. He was a veteran. He was a combat veteran. I was a little surprised during the debates. Williams was criticizing him for being a veteran. He said, why don't you get a job working for a business? He said, I was serving our country. He didn't say I was fighting in Iraq, which would have really put a point on it. But so my point is, I think Knoll on paper was a pretty strong candidate against a pretty weak candidate, but Williams outperformed expectations, deserves credit. And the Democrats, I think they're going to be in a strong position to retool and retake the seat in 2 years from now, learning from these mistakes. But certainly Republicans won the day this time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for listening, everybody. We always enjoy hashing the issues of the day out in these forums. So I guess we'll see you in a year.
I guess so. Thank you so much for joining us, all of our panelists and all of our audience members. Have a great year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.
Bye.